Good morning, class. I hope we're all well. So, for today, we'll be looking at other agreements signed that weakened the League of Nations. So, the League of Nations played an important role in settling a number of international disputes and problems. Its authority, however, tended to be weakened by the fact that many states seemed to prefer signing agreements independently of the League, which suggests they were not exactly brimming with confidence at the League's prospects. So these agreements included the Washington Conferences of 1921 to 1922. Then there was also the Genoa Conference, and following the Genoa Conference of 1922, there was also the Towers Plan. Then there were the Locarno Treaties of 1925. There was also the Kelland-Briand Pact of 1928 and the Young Plan of 1929. And finally, there was also the World Disarmament Conference of 1932 to 1930. So the Washington Conferences of 1921 to 1922 tried to improve relations between the USA and Japan. So the USA was increasingly suspicious of growing Japanese power in the Far East and of Japanese influence in China. This was especially so, keeping in mind that during the First World War, Japan had seized Kiautschou and all the German islands in the Pacific. So it was agreed that the Japanese Navy would be limited to 3/5 of the size of the American and British navies to prevent a naval building race. And Japan agreed to withdraw from Kiautschou and the Shantung province of China, which she had occupied since 1914. So in return, Japan was allowed to keep the former German Pacific Islands as mandates, and the Western powers agreed not to build any more naval bases within striking distance of Japan. So the USA, Japan, Britain, and France agreed to guarantee the neutrality of China and to respect each other's possession in the Far East. At the time, the agreements were regarded as a success, and relations between the powers involved improved supremely. In reality, however, Japan was left supreme in the Far East, possessor of the world's third largest navy, which she could concentrate in the Pacific. And we see that, on the other hand, the navies of Britain and USA, though larger, were spread more widely. So this was to have unfortunate consequences for China in the 1930s, when the USA refused to become involved in checking Japanese aggression. So we move on to the Genoa Conference of 1922. This was the brainchild of Lloyd George, who was a British Prime Minister then. He hoped that it would help solve the pressing problems of Franco-German hostility, as the Germans were threatening to stop paying reparations, that it would also hope to solve European war debts to the USA, and that the need to resume proper diplomatic relations with the USSR would actually begin. So, unfortunately, the conference failed as one. The French refused all compromise and insisted on full reparation payment. And the Americans refused to even attend the conference. And finally, we see that the Russians and Germans withdrew from this, and they signed a mutual agreement together at Trapallo. So in 1923, Germany refused to pay the amount due, and the French troops occupied the Ruhr. And a deadlock quickly developed when the Germans responded with passive resistance. We'll move on to the Towers Plan, which was one of the agreements that weakened the League of Nations. So the plan was drafted in London in 1924 in an attempt to break the deadlock. That is, we see France was occupying the Ruhr and Germany was responding with passive resistance. So MacDonald, Harriet, and Stresemann were newcomers in international politics, and they were very eager for reconciliation. So the Americans were persuaded to take part in this, and the conference was chaired for some time by an American, General Towers. It was agreed that Germany would pay annually only what she could reasonably afford until she became prosperous, but there was to be no reduction in the total amount of reparation that Germany was to pay. So a foreign loan of 800 million gold marks, mostly from the USA, was to be made to Germany. And following this, France agreed to withdraw her troops from the Ruhr. So the Davos plan was successful as the German economy began to recover on the basis of the American loans that it was given, and we also see that international tensions gradually relaxed as well. We'll move on to the Locarno Treaties of 1925. We'll find that there were a number of different agreements involving Germany, France, Britain, Italy, Belgium, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. And the most important one was that Germany, France, and Belgium promised to respect their joint frontiers. So if one of the three broke the agreement, then Britain and Italy would assist the state which was being attacked. Germany signed agreements with Poland and Czechoslovakia, providing for arbitration of a possible disputes, but Germany would not guarantee her frontiers with Poland and Czechoslovakia. So it was also agreed that France would help Poland and Czechoslovakia if Germany attacked them. And the agreements were greeted with wild enthusiasm all over Europe, and the reconciliation between France and Germany was referred to as the Locarno honeymoon. Historians were later on not as enthusiastic about Locarno, as there was one glaring omission from the agreements. So there was no guarantee given by Germany or Britain about Germany's eastern frontiers with Poland and Czechoslovakia, which were the very areas where trouble was most likely to arise. And by ignoring this problem, Britain gave the impression that she might not act if Germany attacked Poland or Czechoslovakia. So for the time being, though, such uneasy thoughts were pushed into the background as the world enjoyed a period of great economic prosperity. And by 1926, we'll see that Germany was allowed to enter the League of Nations. And Stresemann and Briand, who was the French foreign prime minister between 1925 and 1932, met regularly and had friendly discussions. Often, Austen Chamberlain, who was the British foreign minister between 1924 and 1929, also joined them. So the Locarno spirit culminated in the next piece of paper signing. So we have the Kelland-Briand Pact of 1928. So this was originally Briand's idea, and Briand was the French foreign minister of 1925 to 1932. So he proposed that France and the USA should sign a pact renouncing war. And then we see that Frank B. Kellogg, who was the American Secretary of State, proposed that the whole world should be involved, and eventually 65 states signed, agreeing to renounce war as an instrument of national policy. So the pact sounded impressive, but it was completely ineffective, as no mention was made of sanctions against any state which broke its pledge. And we'll find that Japan signed the pact, but 3 years later, they went ahead to wage war against China regardless of the pact. And then we'll move on to the Young Plan of 1929. So the plan aimed to settle the remaining problem of reparations, as the Taoist plan had left the total amount payable uncertain. And in the improved atmosphere, the French were willing to compromise, and a committee chaired by an American banker, Owen Young, decided to reduce reparations from 6,600 million euros to 2,000 million euros to be paid on a graded scale over the next 59 years. It is interesting to note that this was the figure that was originally proposed by Keynes at Versailles, and its acceptance 10 years later was an admission of error by the Allies. So the Young Plan was welcomed in Germany, but before there was time to put it into operation, a series of events following in rapid succession destroyed the fragile harmony of Locarno. So there was the death of Stresemann in October 1929, which removed one of the outstanding men of Locarno. And then this was also followed by the Wall Street crash in the same month, which soon developed into the Great Depression. And by 1932, there were over 6 million unemployed people in Germany. Hope was kept alive by the Lausanne Conference of 1932, at which both Britain and France released Germany from most of the remaining reparations repayment. However, in January 1933, Hitler became German Chancellor, and after that, international tensions mounted. So we'll move on to the World Disarmament Conference. This was held between 1932 and 1933. So it was hosted in Geneva in an attempt to work out a formula for scaling down armament. This is because all League members had undertaken to reduce armaments when they accepted the covenant, and as Stresemann regularly pointed out, Germany was the only state to disarm. None of the other states wanted to follow suit. So if no problem during the Locarno honeymoon, there was little chance of progress in the disturbed atmosphere of the 1930s. So the French, alarmed by the rapid increase in support for the Nazis in Germany, refused to either disarm or to allow Germany equality of armaments with them. And Hitler, knowing that Britain and Italy sympathized with Germany, withdrew from the conference in October 1933, and the conference was dead from that moment. And Hitler further went ahead to withdraw Germany from the League a week after that. And that is it for today. So those are the agreements that weakened the League of Nations. We've looked at the World Disarmament Conference hosted between 1932 and 1933. Then there was also the Young Plan of 1929. There was the Cologne-Briand Pact held in 1928. And then there were also the Locarno Treaties of 1925. We'll also see the Dawes Plan, as well as the Genoa Conference of 1922. And finally, we also looked at the Washington Conferences held between 1921 and 1922.